Marriage drama unfolds. Steve Harvey won't let it continue. Marriage drama unfolds. STEVEHARVEY, let it continue. ACT1. Moral hook, opening 45 seconds. There are moments when patterns of dysfunction become so evident and so harmful that allowing them to continue even for the sake of entertainment becomes unconscionable. What occurred on the Family Feud stage in October 2025 was one of those moments, when a couple's toxic relationship dynamics manifested so clearly and so publicly that Steve Harvey made the immediate decision to stop the game and address the harmful patterns unfolding before him. When Marcus and Diane Turner's passive-aggressive conflict escalated from subtle jabs to open hostility during what should have been a light-hearted game, Steve Harvey recognized that continuing the show would mean enabling behavior that was damaging not just to the couple themselves, but potentially to viewers who might normalize such treatment as acceptable within marriages. This account examines the circumstances that led to that intervention, the specific patterns of dysfunction that prompted Steve Harvey's decisive action, and the aftermath of choosing to prioritize addressing harmful behavior over maintaining entertainment value. Before proceeding with this narrative, if you appreciate content that addresses the importance of healthy relationship dynamics and the responsibility to confront dysfunction rather than enabling it, please take a moment to support this channel by engaging with the like button and subscribing for additional content. Your participation enables the distribution of stories that examine fundamental principles of respect and healthy communication in intimate relationships. ACT2. Character setup, background, and context. Marcus Turner stood at the Family Feud podium at 48 years old, presenting the appearance of a successful professional through his expensive suit and confident demeanor. Marcus worked as a corporate attorney specializing in contract negotiations, a position that required strategic thinking, careful attention to power dynamics, and the ability to identify and exploit weaknesses in opposing positions. The skills that served Marcus well in his professional life had unfortunately transferred into his personal relationships in ways that created significant dysfunction, particularly in his marriage to Diane. Marcus and Diane had been married for 16 years, and their relationship had devolved over time into a pattern of constant competition, passive-aggressive attacks, and subtle undermining that both participants engaged in with increasing frequency and sophistication. Neither partner was clearly the villain or the victim in the relationship. Instead, they had created together a dynamic characterized by mutual contempt, constant scorekeeping, and an approach to conflict that prioritized winning individual battles over maintaining the health and well-being of their relationship. Diane Turner was 46 years old and worked as a marketing director for a pharmaceutical company, a position that required creativity, strategic planning, and management of complex stakeholder relationships. Diane was intelligent, articulate, and professionally successful. However, her marriage to Marcus had brought out qualities that were not present or not as prominent in other areas of her life, including a tendency toward passive-aggressive communication, a need to maintain perceived superiority in interactions, and a pattern of making subtle attacks disguised as jokes or observations that allowed her to hurt Marcus while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. The fundamental problem in Marcus and Diane's marriage was that both individuals approached their relationship as a competition to be won rather than as a partnership to be maintained. Every interaction became an opportunity to score points, to demonstrate superiority, to undermine the other's confidence or position. Disagreements about even minor matters escalated into conflicts where the original issue became irrelevant, and the only concern was ensuring that one did not lose the argument or appear weaker than one's spouse. The pattern manifested in countless ways throughout their daily interactions. If Marcus shared an accomplishment from work, Diane would respond not with celebration, but with a comment that diminished the achievement or redirected attention to her own superior accomplishments. If Diane expressed an opinion about politics or current events, Marcus would immediately challenge her reasoning and suggest that her analysis was superficial or uninformed. If one partner made a mistake, the other would reference it repeatedly in future conversations as evidence of incompetence or poor judgment. The competitive dynamic extended to their roles as parents to their two teenage children. Marcus and Diane had developed patterns of undermining each other's parenting decisions, of using their children as allies in conflicts with each other, and of competing for their children's favor and loyalty rather than presenting a united front. The children had learned to navigate their parents' dysfunction by playing them against each other, by providing each parent with information about the other that would generate conflict, and by exploiting the lack of parental cooperation to obtain permissions and privileges that neither parent would grant independently. Beyond the constant competition and undermining, Marcus and Diane's relationship was characterized by a complete absence of genuine emotional intimacy or vulnerability. Neither partner felt safe expressing actual feelings, needs, or concerns, because any revelation of vulnerability would be stored and later weaponized during conflicts. Both individuals maintained emotional walls that prevented authentic connection while simultaneously resenting their partner for the emotional distance and lack of intimacy in the relationship. The question of why Marcus and Diane remained married despite their obvious dysfunction and unhappiness was complex. Both had significant financial incentives to maintain the marriage, as divorce would require division of substantial assets and would affect their professional images and social standing. Both had become so accustomed to the dysfunctional patterns that they no longer recognized them as abnormal or problematic, instead viewing their relationship as simply what long-term marriages looked like after initial romance faded. Most significantly, both derived a certain satisfaction from the conflict and competition, finding in their battles a form of engagement that felt preferable to the alternative of being alone or starting over with someone new. However, the dysfunction had been escalating over the past several years. What had once been limited to subtle jabs and passive-aggressive comments had evolved into more overt attacks and more frequent explosive arguments. Both Marcus and Diane had separately consulted divorce attorneys to understand their options, though neither had yet committed to actually initiating divorce proceedings. They existed in a state of mutual misery, each hoping the other would be the one to end the marriage so they could claim victim status and avoid responsibility for the dissolution of their family. Friends and family members who interacted with Marcus and Diane had grown increasingly uncomfortable with their public displays of mutual contempt. Dinner parties and social gatherings with the Turners often became tense affairs, as the couple engaged in their competitive sparring and passive-aggressive attacks in front of guests who felt trapped bearing witness to behavior that should have remained private. Some friends had begun declining invitations to events where both Turners would be present, preferring to maintain separate relationships with each individual rather than subjecting themselves to the discomfort of observing their marital dysfunction. The Family Feud appearance had been arranged by Marcus's sister, who had hoped that participating in a fun activity together might remind Marcus and Diane of the reasons they had married and might provide a respite from their constant conflict. The sister had been aware that the marriage was troubled, but had not fully understood the extent of the dysfunction or the ways that competitive activity was likely to escalate rather than mitigate their problematic patterns. The stage was set for a situation where Marcus and Diane's toxic dynamic would manifest publicly in ways that made intervention necessary rather than optional. ACT 3. The struggle dysfunction displayed. The game began with both Marcus and Diane appearing to maintain appropriate behavior and to engage with the competition in ways that seemed normal and entertaining. However, observers with experience recognizing relationship dysfunction would have noticed subtle warning signs from the earliest moments. When Steve Harvey asked the families to introduce themselves, Marcus had spoken for both himself and Diane without allowing her opportunity to speak, and when she had attempted to add information, he had interrupted to correct minor details in ways that suggested her contributions were not needed or valuable. The first round had proceeded with Marcus and Diane's family winning control of the board. As family members consulted about answers, the dynamic between Marcus and Diane began to reveal itself more clearly. When Diane suggested an answer, Marcus immediately dismissed it as unlikely to be on the board and proposed an alternative. When his answer proved to be lower ranked than one Diane had suggested, she made a pointed comment about his tendency to overestimate his own judgment while dismissing hers. The exchange had been delivered with smiles and light tones that might have allowed it to pass as playful banter, but the underlying hostility was evident to anyone paying attention. Steve Harvey had noticed the interaction and had appeared slightly concerned, though he had not yet recognized the full extent of the problem. He had attempted to diffuse any tension with humor, making a joke about married couples always thinking they know better than their spouses. The comment had prompted laughs from the audience, but it also inadvertently normalized the dynamic Marcus and Diane were displaying, suggesting that such interactions were typical rather than problematic. The second round had brought the dysfunction into sharper focus. The question had involved family dynamics and household responsibilities, topics that proved to be fertile ground for Marcus and Diane to demonstrate their toxic patterns. When it was Diane's turn to answer, she had provided a response that appeared on the board as a high-ranking answer. Rather than celebrating her success or acknowledging her correct answer, Marcus had made a comment suggesting that she had been lucky rather than insightful, that anyone could have guessed that answer, and that perhaps she should not celebrate too enthusiastically given how rarely she contributed useful responses. Comment had been delivered in a tone that suggested joking, but the content and the look on Diane's face made clear that this was attack disguised as humor. Diane had responded by referencing a mistake Marcus had made in the previous round, suggesting that perhaps he should focus on his own performance rather than critiquing hers, and noting that his pattern of undermining her was probably why their children respected her judgment more than his. The exchange had created visible discomfort in the studio. The audience's laughter had been uncertain and sparse, as people recognized that what they were witnessing was not playful marital teasing, but rather genuine hostility expressed through socially acceptable vehicles. Other members of the Turner family team had looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or to pretend that the interaction was normal and acceptable. Steve Harvey's expression had shifted from his typical entertaining persona to something more serious and concerned. He had attempted to redirect the family's attention back to the game, but the damage had been done, and the pattern had been established. Marcus and Diane had revealed to everyone present that their relationship was characterized by mutual contempt and by a willingness to hurt each other publicly in ways that suggested even deeper dysfunction in their private interactions. The third round had brought the situation to a crisis point that made intervention necessary rather than optional. The question had asked about qualities people most valued in their spouses. The question was designed to generate positive responses about love, respect, support, and companionship. When the Turner family gained control and family members began providing answers, the contrast between the responses from other family members and the responses from Marcus and Diane became stark and concerning. Marcus's sister had provided an answer about emotional support. Marcus's mother had mentioned kindness and patience. When it became Diane's turn to answer, she had stated with clear sarcasm that what she valued most in a spouse was someone who did not constantly criticize and undermine her, adding that she was still looking for a spouse who met that standard. The comment had been directed at Marcus with unmistakable intent, and it had crossed the line from passive-aggressive to openly aggressive in ways that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Marcus's response had been equally hostile. Rather than allowing the moment to pass or attempting to de-escalate, he had replied that perhaps if Diane were more competent and less defensive about her constant mistakes, she would not interpret reasonable feedback as criticism. He had added that her tendency to play the victim rather than accepting responsibility was exhausting and was the primary reason their marriage had become intolerable. The exchange had occurred on camera in front of a studio audience and in the presence of their extended family members. The hostility was no longer subtle or disguised. The mutual contempt was fully displayed, and the toxic nature of their relationship dynamic was undeniable. Several audience members had audibly gasped, and the production team had begun conferring about whether to intervene and stop the taping. Before the production team could make that decision, Steve Harvey made it for them. He immediately signaled to stop recording and turned to face Marcus and Diane with an expression that conveyed both disappointment and determination to address what was occurring. ACT 4. The turnaround, intervention, and confrontation. Steve Harvey walked to where Marcus and Diane stood at their podium, his typical performance energy completely absent and replaced by seriousness, that made evident his recognition that entertainment values had to give way to addressing harmful behavior that should not be allowed to continue even for one more moment. When he spoke, his voice carried moral authority grounded in his understanding that what he was witnessing was not merely interpersonal conflict, but rather a pattern of mutual abuse that was damaging both participants, and that was inappropriate to allow to continue without direct confrontation. Steve Harvey addressed both Marcus and Diane simultaneously, making clear that his concern and his criticism applied to both of them rather than positioning one as victim and one as perpetrator. He stated directly and without equivocation that their behavior toward each other was unacceptable, that the contempt and hostility they were displaying was not normal marital conflict, but rather toxic dysfunction, and that he would not allow his show to be a platform for them to continue their pattern of publicly attacking and undermining each other. He told them that what they had displayed over the course of 3 rounds was not playful banter, or the kind of good-natured teasing that healthy couples engaged in, but rather genuine mutual contempt expressed through passive-aggressive attacks that had escalated to open hostility. He noted that every interaction between them had been characterized by competition, scorekeeping, and attempts to hurt each other rather than by any evidence of partnership, respect, or genuine care for each other's well-being. Steve Harvey then did something that demonstrated his understanding of the complexity of their situation. Rather than focusing exclusively on individual comments or actions, he addressed the pattern and the system they had created together. He explained that both of them were contributing to a toxic dynamic, that neither could claim victim status when both were actively participating in mutual harm, and that the relationship they had created together was damaging both of them regardless of who could claim to have been more hurtful in any given exchange. Marcus attempted to defend himself and to reframe his behavior as reasonable response to Diane's provocations. He claimed that Diane had started the conflict by making sarcastic comments, that his responses had been justified by her initial attacks, and that if she would simply stop being so sensitive and defensive, they would not have these conflicts. The defense was textbook deflection and blame shifting, and it demonstrated precisely the patterns Steve Harvey had identified as problematic. Diane similarly attempted to defend herself by cataloging Marcus's faults, and by arguing that her responses were justified reactions to years of his criticism and dismissiveness. She claimed that she had been reasonable and patient until Marcus's constant attacks had forced her to defend herself, and that characterizing her responses as equally problematic ignored the power differential and the history of Marcus's behavior toward her. Steve Harvey listened to both defenses and then addressed the fundamental problem that both responses revealed. He noted that both Marcus and Diane were focused entirely on justifying their own behavior and blaming their partner, that neither was taking genuine responsibility for their contributions to the dysfunction, and that their inability to acknowledge their own roles in creating the toxic dynamic meant that nothing could improve unless they fundamentally changed their approach to their relationship. He told them directly that their marriage was failing not because of any single action or any particular grievance, but because they had stopped treating each other with basic respect and dignity, because they had replaced partnership with competition, and because they had allowed contempt to replace whatever affection or care had once existed between them. He stated that the behavior they were displaying was not sustainable, that no relationship could survive sustained mutual contempt, and that they needed to make fundamental changes or acknowledge that their marriage had become too damaged to continue. Steve Harvey then made a decision about how to proceed with the taping. He announced that Marcus and Diane would not continue participating in the game, that their behavior had disqualified them from further participation, and that the rest of their family team could choose whether to continue without them or to withdraw from the competition entirely. When Marcus attempted to object to this decision, Steve Harvey was firm and final in his response. He stated that his show would not be used as a platform for people to engage in public displays of mutual contempt and hostility toward their spouses, that the behavior Marcus and Diane had displayed was harmful and inappropriate regardless of their private circumstances or grievances, and that allowing them to continue would send a message that such treatment was acceptable when it absolutely was not. He made clear that this was not a punishment, but rather a boundary based on his unwillingness to enable dysfunction that was harmful to everyone involved, including the couple themselves. Steve Harvey then did something unexpected and powerful. Rather than simply removing Marcus and Diane from the stage and continuing with the game, he took additional time to address them about their situation and their options going forward. He acknowledged that marriages could experience difficult periods and that conflict was normal, but he emphasized that what they were displaying went beyond normal conflict into patterns of mutual abuse and contempt that required serious intervention rather than continuation. He urged them to seek professional help through marriage counseling, noting that their patterns were too entrenched and too harmful to resolve without professional guidance. He also stated clearly that if counseling did not produce significant changes in how they treated each other, They should seriously consider whether remaining married was in anyone's best interest, including their own, and especially their children's. The directness and seriousness of Steve Harvey's intervention created a moment of apparent recognition for both Marcus and Diane. The performance and defensiveness that had characterized their behavior throughout the taping seemed to diminish at least temporarily, and both appeared to be processing the reality that their relationship had become so dysfunctional that a stranger had felt compelled to stop everything to address it rather than allowing it to continue even for entertainment purposes. ACT 5. The Legacy, Consequences, and Change. The Family Feud episode never aired as a game show segment. The production team determined that broadcasting Marcus and Diane's toxic interactions would normalize destructive relationship patterns and would provide no educational or entertainment value that justified the potential harm. With the couple's consent, obtained after significant deliberation on their part, the network used limited footage to create educational content about toxic relationship dynamics, mutual contempt in marriages, and the importance of seeking professional help when patterns of dysfunction become entrenched. The immediate aftermath of the public confrontation was difficult for both Marcus and Diane. The experience of having their relationship dysfunction exposed and condemned so directly and publicly forced both to confront realities they had been avoiding through their patterns of blame and deflection. Neither could dismiss Steve Harvey's assessment as biased or uninformed, given that it had been based on direct observation and had been delivered with evident concern for their well-being rather than judgment or condemnation. In the days following the Family Feud taping, Marcus and Diane had what they both later described as the most honest conversation they had engaged in during their entire 16-year marriage. Without the immediate opportunity to blame each other or to deflect responsibility, and confronted with the undeniable evidence that their relationship had become so toxic that a television host had stopped production to address it, both were forced to acknowledge their respective contributions to the dysfunction and to determine whether they wanted to attempt repair or to end the marriage. The conversation resulted in a decision to pursue intensive marriage counseling with the understanding that if counseling did not produce significant changes within 6 months, they would proceed with divorce. Both Marcus and Diane acknowledged that their current patterns were unsustainable and harmful, and both expressed at least tentative willingness to examine their own behavior and to attempt different approaches to conflict and communication. The marriage counseling process was extraordinarily difficult and frequently uncomfortable for both participants. The therapist they selected specialized in high-conflict couples and in addressing patterns of mutual contempt and competition. The therapeutic approach required both Marcus and Diane to examine their individual contributions to the dysfunctional dynamic, to identify the underlying needs and fears that drove their defensive and attacking behaviors, and to develop entirely new patterns of communication and conflict resolution. The process revealed that both Marcus and Diane had brought into their marriage unresolved issues from their families of origin, including patterns modeled by their parents and expectations about relationships that had never been explicitly discussed or negotiated. Both had developed defensive strategies in response to feeling unseen or unvalued by their partner, and those strategies had created a self-reinforcing cycle where each partner's defensive behavior triggered defensive responses from the other in ways that prevented any genuine connection or resolution. The counseling also addressed the impact of their relationship dysfunction on their children. Both Marcus and Diane had been forced to confront how their patterns of undermining each other, competing for their children's loyalty, and modeling contemptuous treatment had affected their teenagers' developing understanding of relationships and had created anxiety and stress that the children had been managing without parental support. This recognition provided significant motivation for both to commit to making changes regardless of whether their marriage ultimately survived. 6 months after beginning intensive counseling, Marcus and Diane had made sufficient progress that both felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of their marriage improving rather than ending. They had developed new communication patterns that reduced defensiveness and blame while increasing vulnerability and genuine listening. They had begun addressing underlying issues and needs that had been buried under years of defensive maneuvering. Most significantly, they had stopped treating their relationship as a competition and had begun approaching it as a collaborative partnership where both people's well-being mattered equally. However, the progress was fragile and required constant attention and effort from both partners. Both Marcus and Diane acknowledged that their old patterns remained easily accessible, and that returning to contemptuous and competitive dynamics was a constant risk that required vigilance and commitment to avoid. They continued regular marriage counseling, even as the frequency decreased from weekly to monthly sessions, recognizing that external support and accountability were necessary to maintain the changes they had made. The educational content that was developed using limited footage from the Family Feud incident became an important resource for marriage therapists and relationship educators. The content illustrated clearly the difference between normal marital conflict and toxic patterns characterized by mutual contempt, constant scorekeeping, and competition rather than partnership. Experts who provided commentary emphasized several key lessons that Marcus and Diane's situation demonstrated. First, contempt was identified by research as one of the most reliable predictors of relationship dissolution, and relationships characterized by mutual contempt required immediate professional intervention rather than continued attempts by partners to resolve issues independently. Marcus and Diane's pattern of disguising contempt as humor or justifying it as reasonable response to provocation did not make it less harmful or more acceptable. Second, relationships where both partners focused primarily on cataloging the other's faults and justifying their own behavior rather than taking genuine responsibility for their contributions to problems were unlikely to improve without fundamental changes in approach. The defensive and blame-focused dynamic that Marcus and Diane had demonstrated prevented the vulnerability and accountability necessary for genuine repair. Third, toxic relationship patterns affected not only the couple themselves, but also their children, extended family members, and friends who were forced to witness and navigate the dysfunction. The impact extended beyond the relationship to create broader damage that made intervention and change necessary for multiple people's well-being rather than just the couple's. Finally, professional intervention through marriage counseling, specializing in high-conflict couples, was essential for relationships that had developed entrenched patterns of mutual contempt and dysfunction. The skills and approaches required to address such patterns were not intuitive and could not be developed through general relationship advice or through the couple's independent efforts. 1 year after the Family Feud intervention, Steve Harvey invited Marcus and Diane to appear on his talk show to discuss their experience and their progress. The couple appeared together and spoke openly about how the public confrontation had been humiliating but ultimately necessary, forcing them to confront realities they had been avoiding and providing motivation to make changes they had been unwilling to pursue despite recognizing that their relationship was problematic. Marcus spoke about learning to recognize his patterns of dismissiveness and criticism, understanding the impact those behaviors had on Diane, and developing different ways of managing his own insecurities and needs without attacking his partner. He acknowledged that his professional skills at identifying and exploiting weaknesses had been damaging when applied to his marriage, and that learning to approach his relationship as collaboration rather than competition had required significant unlearning and conscious practice. Diane discussed her recognition that her passive-aggressive communication style and her tendency to store grievances for later deployment during conflicts had been harmful and had prevented genuine resolution of underlying issues. She described learning to express needs and concerns directly rather than through attacks disguised as observations or jokes, and she acknowledged that her contribution to the toxic dynamic had been significant even when she had convinced herself that she was merely responding to Marcus's provocations. Both emphasized that their relationship remained a work in progress, that they continued to struggle with old patterns particularly during periods of stress, and that the changes they had made required ongoing effort and commitment rather than representing a permanent resolution achieved through counseling. However, both also expressed that their marriage had improved substantially, that they were experiencing genuine connection and partnership in ways that had not existed for years, and that they were hopeful about their future together. Steve Harvey spoke during the interview about his decision to stop the Family Feud taping and to confront Marcus and Diane's behavior directly. He emphasized that while entertainment was important, it could not come at the cost of enabling harmful behavior or normalizing toxic relationship patterns. He noted that he had received significant feedback from viewers expressing gratitude that he had chosen to address the situation rather than allowing it to continue, with many people noting that they had recognized elements of their own relationships in what Marcus and Diane had displayed and had been prompted to seek help as a result of seeing the intervention. Before concluding, if this account provided insight into toxic relationship dynamics and the importance of professional intervention when patterns of contempt and competition characterize marriages, please take a moment to engage with this content through the like button and by subscribing to this channel. Organizations such as the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy provide resources for locating qualified therapists specializing in couples counseling. Share this content to help others recognize when relationship patterns have become harmful and require professional help, rather than continued independent attempts at resolution. 3 years after the Family Feud intervention, Marcus and Diane's marriage had stabilized into patterns that both described as significantly healthier and more satisfying than what had existed before the public confrontation. They continued periodic marriage counseling to maintain their progress and to address new challenges as they emerged. Their children reported feeling relief at the reduction in tension and conflict in their household and expressed appreciation that their parents had committed to addressing their problems rather than either continuing toxic patterns or divorcing without attempting repair. The story of Steve Harvey refusing to let the marriage drama continue remained a powerful example of the responsibility that public figures and platforms have to address harmful behavior rather than enabling it through silence or complicity. The intervention demonstrated that entertainment values sometimes must give way to moral responsibility, that confronting dysfunction directly can provide the catalyst necessary for change that might not otherwise occur, and that toxic relationship patterns characterized by mutual contempt require serious attention rather than normalization as typical marital conflict. Marcus and Diane's willingness to pursue genuine change rather than either defending their patterns or ending their marriage illustrated that relationships damaged by years of dysfunction could sometimes be repaired through professional help, sustained effort, and fundamental changes in how partners approached conflict and communication.